In this lecture, we're going to talk about Chapter 7 from the Autism Spectrum Disorders Foundations, Characteristics, and Effective Strategies textbook. And this chapter is on comprehensive behavior interventions for individuals with ASD. Here's just a brief overview of the topics we're going to cover in this lecture. So we're going to talk about functional behavior assessments, addressing underlying needs when developing comprehensive intervention plans for individuals with ASD. We're going to talk about antecedent interventions, and we're also going to talk about how to teach new behaviors. When we conduct functional behavior assessments, or FBAs, we always look at antecedents and consequences related to a behavior. The reason we do this is because events that precede a behavior, or the antecedents, and events that follow a behavior, or consequences, affect that behavior. So by determining the antecedents and consequences, we can make better informed decisions on the possible function of the behavior and possibly determine interventions that may be appropriate for that behavior. So an FBA is a careful analysis of antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, and this can provide us with valuable insight as to why the behavior is occurring or the function of the behavior. So the purpose of a functional behavior assessment is to determine the function of the behavior and then come up with an intervention that the student can also get that function through maybe more appropriate ways. Here is a brief overview of the procedures involved in conducting an FBA. The process is much more detailed and involved than this slide makes it seem, and often your school district will have their own protocol or procedures on how to conduct an FBA. So I've also seen simple and detailed versions of FBAs with some requiring pages of additional information, extra questions that you need to ask people. Just keep in mind that these are all of the steps that you would need to conduct an FBA, but there can be slight variations depending on your school district or policies that you have in place. So the first thing you need to do when conducting an FBA is to define the behavior in observable and measurable terms. This way it shouldn't matter who is observing the student, because if you have a really concrete definition, everyone should be on the same page when recording instances of the behavior. The next step is to gather information through observations, interviews, or other types of records, such as information on referrals or suspensions from a school file, etc. Usually the more information you have, the more helpful it can be, although really you're going to rely heavily on your ABC data anyway. So when you conduct observations of the student, you will be taking ABC data and recording the antecedent, or what happened right before the behavior. Then you're going to collect data on the behavior that you wrote the measurable definition of, and then the consequence, or what happened right after the behavior. So some people get confused on what consequence means. It's not necessarily like the teacher punished them. It's really more about writing down what happened right after the behavior. So that's what the consequence is. It's not necessarily that the student got reprimanded. Then when you conduct interviews, your methods for conducting these interviews will vary. So the people you interview will be different depending on where the behavior occurs. You may follow a structured questionnaire, have them fill out a form, or you may simply talk with them to get more information. So keep in mind that observations are going to be your best method, as the information you gather during interviews can be somewhat subjective. So the data that you have is something that you observed, so that's usually going to be what is going to be best when you can analyze the data. So after you gather the data, you will want to analyze your data and determine a function. If you cannot determine a clear function based on the data that you have, you may want to conduct more observations. So typically when you analyze your ABC data, you're going to be looking for patterns. Some patterns that may emerge are certain types of consequences, such as the child always being sent out of the room, or the teacher always talking with or providing attention to the student, or maybe it is possible that the teacher reprimands the student after behavior. You might also see patterns of types of antecedents, such as the teacher presenting a demand, the teacher telling the class a certain activity is about to end, that sort of thing. So when you look at your ABC data, you're trying to look for patterns in the data. Here is a list of common functions to behaviors. The ones listed in this textbook are escape or avoidance, attainment of attention, attainment of tangible items, access to preferred activities, or sensory stimulation. I have typically heard of there being 4 functions. The 4 functions I have heard of are escape, attention, access to tangibles or preferred activities, and sensory stimulation. So it's basically all the same, it's just a matter of like how you break it up. So regardless of how you break up these categories, these are the main functions for behavior. I would say pretty much every behavior will serve at least one of these functions. Here are some antecedents that might affect behavior. The time of day might play a role in behavior because a student may be more agitated right before a meal, they might get tired towards the end of the day, that sort of thing. So time of day can play a role in behavior. The presence of specific peers or adults may be an antecedent for a particular behavior because it maybe a certain peer provides more reinforcement, or maybe the student bullies the student, both of which could have different effects on how the student behaves. The specific subject can be an antecedent because, as you know, we all tend to have a preference for certain subjects, and we might automatically dislike certain subjects more than others. So this alone can be an antecedent for different types of behavior. Transitioning from a more preferred activity to a less preferred activity is a very common antecedent because typically no one wants to stop doing something they like, such as browsing the internet, to start doing something they don't like, such as writing a paper. A change in routine may be an antecedent for a particular behavior, such as having an unexpected fire drill, or maybe having computer class canceled at the last minute. Those could be changes in routine that are unexpected that may cause behavior. Telling someone to stop a particular behavior can be an antecedent as well. We see this a lot with siblings. One sibling tells the others to stop singing because it's annoying, and that causes the other sibling to start singing more. So when you tell someone to stop a behavior, that can often lead to behavior, or the behavior will continue. There are a variety of interventions you can choose after conducting an FBA. Obviously, it's going to depend on the behavior, the data you can collect, what you determine the function to be. Some interventions include antecedent-based interventions, where you make changes to the antecedent to try and prevent the behavior from occurring. You can try teaching a replacement behavior. This is where you intervene when the behavior is occurring and try to teach a new behavior that is functionally equivalent to the problem behavior. An example of this would be teaching a child to ask for a break during independent work. And another thing you can do is a consequence intervention. An example of a consequence intervention would be using a reinforcement system to change the consequence associated with the behavior. Sometimes you will use a combination of these strategies to intervene on the behavior. When designing a comprehensive plan to address behavioral difficulties, it is important to not only consider what is causing and maintaining the behavior, but to also understand the characteristics of ASD. So if you assume inappropriate behavior is occurring because the child with autism is choosing to do so, and think that maybe he simply needs more discipline, rather than assuming the behavior is occurring because it is related to the underlying ASD, you can cause great damage to a student and may even result in the use of unethical practices. Although sometimes students occasionally engage in inappropriate behavior purposefully, when in doubt, it is always best to assume the behaviors are occurring due to the characteristics of ASD. When you keep in mind the underlying characteristics of ASD when creating interventions, the plans are more likely to be proactive and fundamental. There's the iceberg metaphor, which is a helpful way to remember that visible behaviors, or the portion of the iceberg seen above the water, are manifestations of the underlying characteristics of ASD, or the portion of the iceberg below the water. So comprehensive plans often involve multiple strategies applied across most of the individual's day. The strategies are informed from the FBA and should address the antecedent behavior and consequence. Interventions based on antecedents make changes to the environment in an attempt to prevent the challenging behavior from occurring. They are proactive approaches rather than reactive approaches, and there are three main types of antecedent interventions. Those are sensory and biological interventions, task demand modifications, and structure and visual or tactile supports. So we will talk more about each of these on the next slides. Sensory and biological interventions can be difficult because you might not know what the unmet biological needs are, or if the student is hypo or hypersensitive to certain things in the environment. So it can be difficult because you don't know what the unmet needs are. You're just sort of guessing. So I would not suggest using biological or sensory interventions on their own, but they may be useful in conjunction with other strategies, especially if it is really clear what the sensory or biological needs are, such as adding an additional snack time because the student doesn't eat lunch until 12:45 and you know that the student comes to school without eating breakfast. Providing headphones during a fire drill or assembly, or using a study corral for independent work are other examples of interventions for sensory needs. But I want to just again caution against using these types of interventions or assuming that the student needs some type of sensory intervention, because there's actually no evidence in autism research that supports the use of sensory interventions. So I agree that they are sometimes appropriate to use, like the headphones or study corrals, but I would just recommend either using them to supplement another intervention, in addition to just using the sensory intervention. Another type of intervention is task demand modifications. Problem behavior has a tendency to occur when tasks are too easy and students get bored, or when tasks are too difficult and students get frustrated. Tasks in the acquisition of instruction should be within Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. This means that skills not yet mastered but are in the process of maturing, or students are close to acquiring these skills. Tasks that are mastered should be independent work, and tasks that are too challenging should be completed with support to ensure success. So just because, though, that these skills are mastered and expected to be completed independently doesn't mean you won't need an intervention for independent work. So you may still need an intervention that allows for frequent breaks or to increase on-task behavior. The task demand modifications, though, is more about understanding that behavior problems can occur when tasks are too difficult or too easy and trying to sort of plan for that. Another type of antecedent intervention is structure and visual or tactile supports. So limitations in verbal communication and a need for routine and order sometimes require that specialized supports be put into place for individuals with ASD. Because students with ASD tend to be more visual, it can be helpful to present information visually whenever possible. But be careful about using excessive visuals just because you think it might be helpful. I know a lot of times we think, oh, students with ASD, they respond so well to visuals, and so we just incorporate visuals into everything, or we think that that's going to be the answer. So, for example, you might be tempted to make an individual schedule for a student with ASD in your class because you know he is a visual learner and likes to know the daily routine, but it may be an unnecessary intervention or accommodation if the student can follow the daily schedule that is on the board. So examples of other types of visuals include written schedules, pictures, task strips, and video modeling. While antecedent behaviors may prevent problem behavior, Another way to address challenging behavior can be to teach new behaviors. Sometimes challenging behavior may occur because the student has certain skill deficits and may need to be taught new skills. Individuals with ASD do not always learn naturally like their typically developing peers, and often need direct instruction to learn skills. Reinforcement is very important when attempting to change someone's behavior. We hear a lot of time about schools and school personnel who don't believe in rewards and reinforcement. Often they're just misinformed, and this is really sad because reinforcement is really important. And a lot of times people think that it's unnecessary. We're just giving them candy just to give them candy. But it can be helpful to try to educate people on what reinforcement is. And reinforcement is defined as a situation or event that follows a particular behavior, resulting in an increased likelihood that a behavior will occur again in the future. So that being said, if a behavior occurs frequently, it is assumed that the event that follows that behavior is maintaining or reinforcing the behavior. For instance, a student may talk out of turn in class, and every time he does, the teacher acknowledges it in some way. It could be that they let the student speak, they talk to him and say, yes, what did you have to say? Or they might say, it's not your turn, but either way, they're providing some sort of attention. So she might be inadvertently reinforcing the student's behavior by providing him with that intention. So if we are teaching a student a new skill, we need to provide some sort of reinforcement if we want to increase the future likelihood of that behavior occurring again. And whenever we devise interventions, we need to plan for how we will work on generalizing the behavior and how we will maintain the behavior. Generalization can occur across settings, across people, and across behaviors. So if we train a student to do independent work for 5 minutes in the resource room, we want to have a plan in place for how the student will also do this in the general education classroom with new teachers. Maintenance refers to keeping the behaviors over time, so we don't always want to have to provide a token every time the student completes 5 math problems. So we need to have a plan to thin our schedule of reinforcement so the student continues to do the behavior without as much reinforcement from us. So that is important too when you're talking to people who are against reinforcement. If you can come up with a plan and have a plan for fading reinforcement, that could be important as well. So you might provide a lot of reinforcement in the beginning, and then by the end of the intervention, you're not providing as much.